everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is the first in my Sewing Through the Decades series, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I would suggest you check out the introduction video that I made earlier this week. It'll be linked up above as well as in the description box down below. But the short way to describe this project is that I'm sewing my way through the 20th century, one decade at a time, using original vintage patterns as my guide. And if you couldn't guess based off of my outfit, I'm currently working on the first decade of the 20th century, which is 1900 to 1910. I couldn't find a dress pattern for 1900, so I'm actually going to be following two from this decade, one for the skirt I'm currently wearing, and one for the blouse. This pattern is by the McCall Pattern Company, who are still around and making patterns today. They were actually established in 1870, but this specific pattern was patented in 1908. This pattern is number 2877, and it is for a lady's 8 Gore skirt. Historical patterns are a little bit different than modern ones. The tissue paper is completely unprinted and is instead marked with perforations. They also don't provide you with a lot of instructions, since there's definitely an expectation that you know what you're doing when you purchase the pattern. So for this lady's 8 Gore skirt with inserted pleated sections, there are a grand total of 6 steps and a little diagram to help you through that process. Though I found the process of putting this together relatively easy, it definitely requires more than 6 steps, and there's quite a lot that you have to do in between what they guide you to do. So following this was an interesting process, but I did really enjoy it, and I think it was a great way to start off this series. But before getting into the footage, I want to remind you that this project and this entire series are funded by my Patreon. So if you enjoy this video and you'd like to see more of them, as well as behind the scenes content, then please consider checking that out. There will be a link in the description box. I also want to give you a warning that this was my first video filmed on my new camera, so I did end up having quite a few lighting problems that I unfortunately didn't notice until I was editing and didn't have a chance to correct in the later clips. So that is resolved for the future videos in this series, but it was definitely a problem in this one. So I apologize for that. And on that note, here's the video, and I really hope you enjoy.
This pattern was patented on April 21st, 1908, making it exactly 89 years older than me. It is by a little brand you may have heard of called the McCall Pattern Company. This pattern is for an 8-piece gored skirt with inserted pleated sections. The size I purchased is for a 26-inch waist and 44-inch hips. Unlike modern patterns, Edwardian patterns were pre-cut to a single set of measurements that corresponded with the waist size you purchased, which means I had to look long and hard for one in my size. Early 20th century patterns also provided little information about constructing the garment. This one features a numbered diagram with 6 sentences that coordinate with the step, along with a note describing each piece and what the perforations on each piece indicate. At this point in time, patterns were not printed. Instead, seam allowance, pleats, grain lines, pattern numbers, and pin tucks were all indicated with perforations cut into the tissue paper. The only ink markings are on the envelope itself. Despite the lack of instructions this pattern provided, I found the construction surprisingly easy. I think if you know how to sew, it's relatively intuitive to construct, which I'm sure they were depending on considering how little information they provide. I wanted to keep my materials authentic to the period, so I picked a medium weight 100% wool suiting. Wool was a very popular choice for women's garments during this time, and it was in line with the fabric suggestions from this pattern catalog, which is dated 1909. Fun fact, these images are advertisements from the Butter Company, which predates McCall's patterns by 7 years. But they were later acquired by McCall's, and all of their old advertisements currently sit in their archives. This pattern had all of the pieces, except for the waistband, which wasn't included. So I drafted something myself that I feel is probably similar. I also used this pattern to create a mock-up a day before filming this video. The mock-up ended up 10 inches too big for me in the waist and 3 inches too short. I used a pencil to mark the alterations onto my tissue and will be keeping those in mind when cutting the pattern out. Here's an example of the perforations used to mark these pieces. The rectangular perforations indicate seam allowance, and a mixture of small and large dots mark where the material is pleated. I carefully ironed the pieces off camera to remove creases so I could jump right into pinning them to my fabric. My fabric is 60 inches wide and folded vertically. To cut this skirt from 60-inch wide fabric, you only need 2.5 yards, which is pretty impressive. The center front piece has 3 T perforations across one edge, which indicates it should be placed on a fold. The other pieces don't require this, but do have 3 large dots marking their grain line, which I tried to keep vertical on the material. I also made sure to leave enough room at the ends of the pieces to add 3 inches to the hems. Shockingly, this wasn't drafted with someone who is 5'10" in mind. Moving on to the side gores. For these, and all the pieces really, it was crucial to cut the notches. The notches are really the only indicator for figuring out which pieces go where, so I made sure to get them all and double-checked before removing the pattern, because the construction might be relatively self-explanatory, but only if you know which piece is attached to what. Here's a better view of the 3+ markings, which indicate the piece needs to be cut on a folded edge. Though these were easy to follow when I could make out what they were, it wasn't always obvious whether they were dots or crosses, since this pattern had used before and the perforations were a little bit distorted. Actually, I should just go ahead and read you their cutting instructions. To cut, arrange belt with edge having 3 crosses on crosswise fold, other pieces with 3 crosses on lengthwise fold, and remaining pieces with 4 large circles lengthwise on the material. These are called the inserted pieces, lovingly lettered T and R. These pieces will be folded into inverted box pleats, and you guessed it, perforations in the pattern mark those pleats. I'm simply using chalk to mark these perforations on both sides of the soon-to-be pleated fabric, and once again I've added 3 inches of ease to the hems. This is exciting! There are actual instructions for pleating the skirt. It says crease material at crosses, bring creases to small circles, and stitch 1/8 of an inch from creases as far down as second marking. Not the simplest way to describe an inverted box pleat, but this is in fact an inverted box pleat, and the perforations made it pretty easy to mark and fold. I'm using a horizontal pin to mark where the top stitching will end, and vertical pins to keep the fabric positioned properly. This was repeated for all 4 panels. Then I ironed the pieces to the best of my ability while keeping the pins in the fabric. In hindsight, I would have top stitched the pleats down before doing this, but it did help define the creases, which is never a bad thing when it comes to pleats. The pleats were stitched down with matching thread and a medium stitch length. I sewed a little closer to the edge than they instructed me to, since I thought that gave a cleaner finish. Those pieces were ironed once more, and I left the pins in once again since the wool did not iron especially well and I didn't want the pleats to lose their shape during construction. I also prepared the side cord panel. Oh my god. I also prepared the side cord panel. I also prepared the side core panels, which will be stitched on top of the inserted pieces, and I did this by using chalk to mark a line 1 inch away from the hem, then folding the hem up to that line and ironing it down. I marked a line 1/2 inch away from the top edge of the inserted pieces. Now I'm going to align the folded edge of the side gores with the chalk marking on the pleated pieces and pin them together. This is shown in the diagram as step 3 and simply referred to as joining. The corresponding instructions say, fold under lower edge of side front and side back gores at small circles and lap over upper edge of pleated sections with notches and edges even, stitched to position 3/8 of an inch from edge. The notches were a crucial part to this step. The front and back gores look very similar, as do the front and back pleated sections, so getting them lined up properly was all thanks to these notches. After everything was pinned, I top stitched the pieces together. They suggest stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the folded edge, but I thought that was a little much considering the material only folds under by 1/2 inch. I ended up sewing closer to 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, which I think looks a lot better anyway. And I did use a top stitching foot to make this process a little bit easier. It's useless on thinner fabrics, but worked really well for this piece. It's time for step 4, which is called lapped seams. For this they say, fold underside edges of front, side, and back gores at small circles and lap over joining gores and inserted sections with notches and edges even. And based on the seam perforations, these pieces should only be lapped by 1/2 inch. But that left me with 10 inches of extra room in the waist on my mock-up, so I'm sewing them with a 1 inch allowance instead. I started this process by marking a chalk line 1 inch away from the edges of the inserted pieces on the right side of the fabric. Then for the panels that will overlap those, I used chalk to mark lines 2 inches away from all the edges, and these are marked on the wrong side of the fabric. I ironed the edges of the panels that will overlap inward by 1 inch until the raw edge touched the chalk line. Or at least I tried to. This part was so frustrating. This fabric is more stubborn than I am, which is saying a lot. I could dunk it in water and leave the iron on it for 60 seconds and the edges would still pop up and flatten out like nothing had happened. I mean, it was kind of incredible, but extremely annoying given the circumstances. I did eventually get the edges pressed, but it took about 4 times longer than I thought it would. Now I'm lining pieces up so the notches match, then pinning the folded edges to the chalk markings on the inserted pieces. And once again, notches were a crucial part of doing this. Without them, it's just a bunch of similar looking gored panels. Since the wool panels were quite heavy and I wanted the most control over the top stitching as possible, I worked in 2 or 3 piece sections instead of pinning everything together at once. When my first set of sections were pinned, I went back to the machine and top stitched the pieces together. And once again, I'm using that handy top stitching foot. And when I could, I started sewing these panels together from the top, sewing towards the hem. That way, if anything shifts, it'll push excess material towards the hem and keep the waistline level. I pinned a few more sections. Here you can really see how much the wool flattened out, even after ironing the folded edges. I should also mention step 5 here, which is titled Placket, and says leave side back edges free above notches. So the top 12 or so inches of the left back panel were left open to create a closure point. At this point, I just had the side seams left to sew, but before doing that, I decided to address the placket. Though none of the other edges in the skirt will be finished, it bothered me that these were left raw, since this part of the garment will get the most abuse and be the most likely to fray. It also bothered me that the overlapping panel didn't have any top stitching at this point, so I fixed that with 2 rows of stitching. And to fix the potential future fraying, I bound the other side edge with some lace binding. This pattern doesn't specify closures, but since the skirt is relatively fitted, this portion gapes when it is left open. I used pins to position the pieces together, making sure the folded edge lined up with the chalk marking I originally made on all the skirt pieces. Then I used a mixture of chalk and pins to mark the closure placement. Hooks would have been the most accurate closure, but I didn't have any black ones on hand, so I chose to use snaps instead. 4 of these were sewn onto the side back, each spaced about 1.5 inches apart. As a side note, I am never using my camera's auto exposure for making videos again. It was all over the place in this footage, even though the light source didn't change at all. Super annoying to watch and edit, so sorry about that. Now I pinned the second to last seam, and yes, I do sometimes sit on my table to get a better angle. That was sewn, and now it was time for the final side seam. This one was by far the hardest to pin and sew since I had 3 other yards of fabric in my way. I stopped to feel underneath the skirt several times since I wanted to make sure I wasn't catching another layer of fabric by mistake. I ironed the skirt to the best of my ability, then set it aside. Now it was time to work on the waistband, which I cut out earlier in the video. To create a guide for where to turn the edge inward, I stitched a line 1/2 inch away from the bottom edge of the waistband. But this didn't go particularly well since I still had the top stitching foot on, and it did not like this. Then I ironed that edge inward at the line of stitching, to the best of my ability at least, considering this fabric. Then I lined the center of the waistband up with the center front of the skirt and pinned them with the right side of the waistband facing the wrong side of the skirt. I also folded the ends of the waistband over the edges of the skirt. This might feel a little unintuitive, but once the waistband is turned outward, it will hide the raw edges underneath and look all nice and pretty. The waistband was stitched on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I folded the waistband outward until it sat flat against the front of the skirt and pinned it down. Since I had some trouble folding the bottom edge inward evenly, I measured various points of the waistband after pinning it in position to make sure it was all the same width. I top stitched around the edges of the waistband using my fancy top stitching foot for the final time on this project. Now I could sew in the final skirt closure. Once again, hooks and bars would have been the most accurate, but I chose a larger hook and eye closure since they are stronger and easier to do up on your own. These are easier to sew in than standard hooks too, since the portions you stitch through are molded metal as opposed to bent wire, which means the thread is less likely to get caught. And I just picked some of these up from Joann's. They aren't a fancy item. With the closures done, I could try the skirt on and mark the hem placement. I originally thought I would have enough length to do a 2-inch hem, so here you can see me marking a line 4 inches away from the bottom edge, then turning the hem upward so it touches that line. Unfortunately, the fitting didn't go particularly well and the skirt was way too short, so instead of doing a 2-inch hem, I opted for a 1/2 inch rolled hem. Not as historically accurate or pretty, but it gets the job done. I stitched the hem down by hand using medium whip stitches. With thinner fabrics, I have to make these stitches really dense to ensure an even hem, but the wool was pretty forgiving for this step. Like with a lot of the other steps, there weren't any instructions regarding the hem. There was definitely an expectation during this time that anyone who purchased printed patterns had enough sewing experience to construct these pieces without much guidance. I struggled with this since I want to follow the instructions. I feel like that is part of what makes this series interesting, but they don't provide you with enough information to do that. There are a bunch of steps you have to make up in between the ones they list, otherwise you'll end up with a half-finished, unwearable garment. So it was definitely a challenge to try and balance what they told me to do with what I wanted to do. It would have been fine if I had made up all the instructions or if they had walked me through every step, but to combine my personal methods with theirs was really difficult. And that is the end of this project. I had to give it another thorough ironing, especially around the pleats and hem, but aside from that, it was done. Overall, I'm really happy with this piece. The pattern was surprisingly easy to follow, and the perforations were really effective for marking the pleats. There was definitely something off with the sizing, but that was easily fixed by making the seam allowance larger. I think this was a good way to start off the series, and I'm so excited for the videos to come. I hope you'll stick around for next week's video where I tackle the shirtwaist. And if you're too eager to wait for that video and want early access, along with access to behind-the-scenes footage, please consider supporting my Patreon and continuing to fund the series. I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I hope you will subscribe and stick around if you did, since I have many more of these pieces planned. Thanks again for watching, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.